love you!
Welcome to TEDx Winnipeg 2019, and thank you to the two people that have decided to attend my TED Talk. The topic we're going to be discussing this evening is the idea that saying is believing. So one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, does modifying the intended message to a listener have a lasting effect on the communicator's evaluation of the person? I've seen this a lot in different walks of life. For me, as a youth pastor, as a part-time youth leader at my church, I've noticed a lot that in order to get my message across as a person, sometimes depending on whether you know the child likes you or not as a leader, and we all know that sometimes children don't like you as a leader, you may have to modify the way that you express your feelings or you express concern for a situation depending upon how you want the child or how you want the person to react in a certain situation. So this will be kind of debunking that question of, do communicators modify their messages about an issue towards the listener's position on the issue? And there is, of course, evidence advocating or even summarizing a position on some issue that can affect communicators' expressed opinion on the issue. Next slide, please. So the effects of attitude change towards communication. So the communicator, or in this case the presenter, described the stimulus person to the listener who either liked or disliked the stimulus person. Depending on the position of the listener, the communicator will change the message about the stimulus person to match the listener's attitude. The communicator may also wish to describe the stimulus person in a way that causes the listener to be able to identify the stimulus person more easily. And communicators may also apply labels to the stimuli and or the listener to identify the ways in which he or she can rely on his or her message. Next slide, please. So communicator labeling. When the communicator uses this method of labeling, the communicator will determine whether or not the listener likes the stimulus person. If the listener likes this person, the stimulus will be labeled as confident. Okay, so you're going to be, this is referring to if the listener, so the person in the audience listening to the communicator likes listening to said person, then the stimulus will be labeled as confident by the listener. If the listener, and this works in the opposite too, if the listener dislikes the person, the stimulus will be labeled as conceited in order to get the message across in a way that will... Anyways, I digress. This method is used to describe many other attitudes as well, depending again on whether the listener likes or dislikes the stimulus. Message modification and message and judgments. So how does message modification affect a communicator's message and judgments? Labeling assigns meaning to the stimulus by connecting it to cognitive category designated by the label. So once the communicator labels the stimulus, the information recalled becomes a part of the presentation to stay consistent towards the listener. So in other words, you want to keep information that's relevant to your listeners, so to keep your listeners engaged. And sometimes that may mean that the communicators will change the information to better suit the audience's or the listener's needs, or to keep the listeners engaged in the conversation. So once the communicator labels the stimulus, the information recalled becomes a part of the presentation to stay consistent towards the listener. And this can cause the information being communicated, as I mentioned before, to become distorted or a little tweaked. So message modification and effects on the stimulus. If the communicator caters too much to the listener's attitude, the communicator may inadvertently cause the information to be skewed slightly. This can become more positive or negative than the original stimulus, depending on how the messenger is portrayed, or the message is portrayed, sorry. And if the communicator is later asked to describe the original stimulus information, the communicator may instead recall the modified information rather than the original stimulus information. So the study that ensued from this was, you have a question? Okay. What do you, okay. Sorry, I had one of my audience members raising their hands, but they don't want to ask any questions, so we're going to continue along this. So back to message modification and the effects of the communicator. So because the stimulus information has now been skewed, the communicator's later evaluation of the stimulus becomes biased towards the information which the communicator is able to recall. So the stimulus has been given sets of information to the communicator at the beginning of the presentation, and depending on the listener's engagement, the communicator may choose to change that information slightly, and because they change that information slightly, when given a time period, when given a time period to reflect on the information that was originally given by the stimuli, more often than not, the communicator will rely on his or her recollection of what was said and will forget parts of what the stimuli has originally communicated to the communicator. Because the stimulus information has now been skewed, the communicator's later evaluation of the stimulus becomes biased towards the information which the communicator is able to recall, and the information which the communicator evaluates may not be the information about the original stimulus. Depending on when the communicator is asked to evaluate the stimulus, the communicator will forget more and more about the original stimulus and rely mostly on their own recollection to evaluate the stimulus. Increased heavily, and this is increased heavily, especially over a 2-week period. So message formation. The process of message modification occurs during the formation of the message itself. Zimmerman and Bauer in 1956 found that subjects who wrote a short summary of the information they received on an issue were later able to reproduce the stimulus information more accurately and when it was congruent with the intended audience. So in other words, if it met the needs of the audience. In this case, the subject's reproduction of the information was affected only when there was a long delay period prior to reproduction. So method overview. So this is going to now to the field test, which Higgins performed, in which 78 Princeton undergraduates were given 4 positive, negative, and ambiguous descriptions of a stimulus person. They then had to summarize the essay for someone who either liked or disliked the person. And after reading, half wrote a summary. Half wrote a summary called message conditioning, and the other half didn't. And this, of course, there was no message conditioning in this instance. After either a 15 to 20 minute filler task, so a brief delay conditioning, or a 12 to 15 day long delay conditioning, subjects rated the stimulus person and attempted to recreate the original paragraph. Originally, 88 students were chosen to participate in this study. However, 10 were eliminated immediately, either for failing to show up or failing to follow instructions, and subjects were evenly distributed among the different conditions. So the essay itself, the essay, as stated previously, consisted of 4 ambiguous, positive, and negative traits about the person, and this was collected on the basis of normative data collected by Higgins et al. In 1977. These were each characterized equally by positive traits. So for example, someone being independent or self-reliant, as well as their opposite traits. For example, being aloof or being classified as a loner. The descriptions. The independent aloof description, other than the independent or aloof description that was given as part of the paragraph that these students had to summarize was this. Other than socially described engagements, Donald's contact with others is rather limited, and he feels he does not need to rely on anyone. The opposite, which these students had to reflect on and either give a message on or not, depending on the situation they found themselves in, was the persistent or stubborn approach, which was stated as, once Donald makes up his mind to do something, it is as good as done. So depending on how much the subject liked the stimulus person, the ratings given for the essay changed. And half of the students were then told to write a message about the stimulus person, and the other half did not, as I mentioned previously. So as per the results from this test, if you wish to look at the numbers themselves, you can look on my slideshow, which will be provided at the end of this TED Talk. However, for time's sake, I will just mention that the findings that resulted from this test were that people were, of course, more likely to respond positively to the stimulus if the listener liked the stimulus than they were if the listener disliked the stimulus. So results in distortion and the effects on reproduction. Message modification to suit the recipient's attitude was expected to affect the communicator's reproduction of the stimulus information, whereas no effect was expected for those subjects who did not actually produce a message. And that's going back to how half of the people that participated in the study wrote a message and half did not. So effects on liking. An analysis of the subject's evaluation of the stimulus person as a function of recipient's attitude, message condition, and temporal delay indicated that subjects' evaluations were higher when the message recipient liked the stimulus person, as I stated earlier. The relation between liking and message reproduction. Subjects expressed liking for the stimulus person in message conditions were positively correlated with both desirability of their messages and the desirability of their reproductions. And if you'd like to look at the messages or the numbers, again, you can look at the slideshow that will be provided at the end of this TED Talk. The relationship between message labels and the stimulus. So in order to examine directly the relation between subject message labels and their evaluation of the stimulus person, the messages were divided into 3 categories: a 2-to-1 or greater ratio of positive to negative labels, a 2-to-1 or greater ratio of negative to positive labels, and a ratio of less than 2-to-1 in either direction. Likableness ratings were divided into 3 categories, from +2 to +5, from -2 to -5, and from -1 to +1. There was a strong tendency for a subject's evaluation of the stimulus person to match the evaluative tone of his or her message labels, and that number is 67% in agreement. So in conclusion, subjects had to describe a stimulus person in a way that would enable the message recipients to identify the person, and this was consistent with other studies that were similar that had been performed in years earlier. Subjects modified their messages to suit the attitude of the recipient. The labels, evaluative distortions, and overall desirability of subjects' messages were all relatively more positive when the recipient liked the stimulus person than when the recipient disliked the stimulus person. If such message modification also affects the communicator's memory and evaluation of the message topic, as we would expect, when simply following the rules for effective communication may affect a communicator's own objectivity. In fact, message modification may play a significant role in forming and maintaining false and harmful characterizations, both with respect to other persons and social groups, for example, racial or ethnic stereotypes, and with respect to oneself, for example, distorted self-perceptions. And then receptions. Thank you for coming out and listening to my TED Talk this evening. Am I just gonna leave now? Okay. Okay, cool.
Can I try mine? I don't know if I'll be ready, but...
Is it like